Good afternoon, class. This is the last thing I'm going to do before I take what I think is a well-deserved break anyway, prior to leaving Friday for Thanksgiving break. I hope you all have a wonderful week and get a chance to rest up and maybe also put some finishing touches on some work that we have still hanging out there before we wrap up the quarter. Anyway, I'm starting with this slide because today we started talking about the historical foundations or the origins of the Cuban Revolution. And so I'm just going to briefly clip through here. I'm not going to really make any comments because I provided those in class. But if there were some things that this helps, parts of your memory are jogged by this, that's great. We know that the United States, essentially the general trend that I put in place for class today while we were moving through is that in some ways the United States kind of took over the Cuban independence movement, which was a native effort that was really begun by the likes of people like Jose Marti. But by the time the Spanish are challenged and the United States enters into the fray and helps put a rather quick and powerful end to the Spanish-Cuban-American War, we can see that after the U.S. presence begins in Cuba, as you might expect from a conflict where one relies upon a powerful neighbor to help them place the finishing touches upon it, usually the post-war order will bear the mark or bear the imprint of that same powerful member. So we talked a little bit about the Platt Amendment. You read it. It put in place some rather interesting, some curious provisions, provisions that the Cuban people, particularly those who had been strong fans of the independence movement, would have likely resented. And in fact, many of them did. So this brings us more closely. We're not quite to the eve of the revolution, but by the later 20th century, the United States has established a rather close relationship based on many of its investments, its capital investments in things like the Cuban sugar, cigar, rum, and railroad sectors of the Cuban economy. And Fulgencio Batista is a very important, a remarkable character in this lead up to the Cuban Revolution. He is essentially a politician with at least two lives, and in his first round of leadership within Cuba, he's largely a reformer, and he accomplishes some pretty interesting policies. He comes alongside, in many respects, many of the poorer sectors of the Cuban economy. Those who are victims of debt peonage, the indebted many, who are oftentimes indebted to the wealthy industrialists and capitalists, those who own much of the land within Cuba. And he does some pretty important reforms to help lift up many tenant farmers from debt peonage and increases wages for those who are working in the urban industries of Cuba. However, as he does this, he also becomes, over time, increasingly under the advice and under the influence of his powerful neighbor to the north, the United States. And of course, after World War II, there's going to be a very dramatic shift in global thinking. Very much we start to enter into a bipolar power arrangement following World War II. And the two poles of those powers are, of course, the United States in the West and the Soviet Union in the East. This is now the Cold War era. So very small, even minor differences that exist in various parts throughout the world are oftentimes interpreted through this Cold War lens. And so as a result, Fulgencio Batista increasingly feels the pressure and responds to the pressure of being more or less a puppet of the United States. And this means being a strong anti-communist. And so he comes back to power. His timing is really interesting. You'll remember from our documentary the other day that in 1952, Fidel Castro was hoping to enter into and win elected office within the Cuban government. And as the elections of 1952 are nearing, Castro's ambitions are going to be squelched because Fulgencio Batista is going to take power in a military coup. So you can see that this would not be very welcome, and it would be a source of anger for Castro. And Castro, being the willful, stubborn person that he is, he doesn't forget. And that's how people get to be like Castro, is by remembering who's done them wrong and being very, very stubborn about making sure that they feel the revenge, because then people learn to fear you, and they know that when you mess with Fidel Castro, you're going to have perhaps more than you bargained for. And so Batista comes back in the 1950s very much wearing the puppet hat of the United States. And this is going to make the United States indirectly a source of frustration and anger for the emerging revolutionary Fidel Castro. So the Cuban Revolution can probably be traced back as early as 1953. The documentary talked about Castro and his fellow revolutionaries, their failed bid to storm the Moncada barracks, which was a military installation where many of the arms of the Cuban military were stored. This is sort of a half-baked plot to, essentially take over and create sort of a chain reaction of revolution throughout Cuba. Well, it doesn't go so well. Many of the Moncada barracks revolutionaries are gunned down. In fact, Castro somewhat remarkably survives, and this won't be the only time he survives against overwhelming odds against him. But the Moncada barracks really sort of are the first thing that put Castro on the national stage in Cuba, and he is imprisoned for several months, a little over a year, and while he's in prison he writes a speech that he builds upon, part of his defense speech as he is appearing before the Cuban courts. He famously says, "Go ahead, condemn me, execute me if you must, history will absolve me." Meaning, I am on the right side of this issue. The issue of Cuban independence and Cuban freedom is what really matters here, and if you want to stop me, then you're essentially stopping the inevitable momentum of history. So he is freed from prison several months later in 1950, and actually I believe it's in 1954, so it's about a year and a half later. He flees to Mexico, and that's where he meets Che Guevara. He and a number of about 80 some, I think it's 82 if you include Castro, they launch another sort of half-baked plan to take over Cuba, involving the Grand Maw, which is this boat that they take to try to infiltrate back into Cuba from Mexico. It is a failure. The Batista regime notices and recognizes their arrival, guns them down. Again, Castro, with his many political and revolutionary lives, escapes now into the Sierra Maestra, which are the mountains of central Cuba, and here he starts his movement that gains real traction, particularly with the coverage given to it by Herbert Matthews, an important New York Times journalist, who gives the movement, the Cuban Revolutionary Movement, a lot of important publicity. By January 1st of 1959, the guerrillas, the revolutionary guerrillas who are hiding out in the Sierra Maestra, are going to have created enough of a popular stir. This is coupled with Batista's botched, essentially overplaying of his hand and his power, and that combination sets the stage for the opportune time of the revolutionaries to come to power. Here we have a picture of Fidel and Che, the two sort of powerful symbols of the Cuban Revolution. Che was very much a committed follower of Castro, who felt particularly a strong affinity for the everyday peasants, not just in Cuba, but in every other places as well. In fact, Che is going to leave the Cuban Revolutionary Movement once it's been a success, and he will go down to Bolivia, where ultimately he will meet his end as he's trying to essentially nurture a similar revolutionary movement down in Central South America. Okay, so the United States, of course, is uneasy, as I mentioned in class. They don't know exactly what to make of this new phenomenon named Fidel Castro. The Eisenhower administration at first acts as though everything is fine. They, on a modest level, support the excitement surrounding Castro and his emergence. We know Castro comes to the United States on something of a revolutionary victory tour. But things start to become very uneasy in the relationship between the United States and Cuba. And a lot of this starts with the way that Castro treats his political enemies. He's very harsh. He does not allow for differences of opinion. The protests of those who do not support Castro are met with very harsh crackdowns. In 1960, early on in 1960, Cuba begins to establish a relationship with the Soviet Union, which of course is very disquieting for the United States as they're in the midst of a Cold War with the Soviet Union. The United States responds by passing restrictions. So now Cuba is receiving oil from the Soviet Union in exchange for sugar, but the United States takes and requires, or I should say no longer permits, Soviet oil to be refined in Cuban refineries. And in response, Fidel will nationalize the U.S.-owned oil refineries in Cuba. And this, of course, is a very frightening and frustrating act for the United States. The United States responds by boycotting the sugar industry, which up until that moment the United States had bought about half of Cuba's sugar. So the Cuban economy is going through some demanding challenges, and Cuba very quickly weans itself of any dependence upon the United States, and for the most part exchanges that dependence from the United States in favor of depending upon the Soviet Union. And that's where things stand in very early 1960. The United States, very much angry by Castro, very much angered by Castro and his sort of disrespectful, somewhat nonchalant dismissals of American power. The United States tries a number of different methods to eliminate Castro, and one of the most famous examples of this was the Bay of Pigs invasion, which had been a CIA plot that was hatched under the Eisenhower administration. It was passed along to the Kennedys when John F. Kennedy took office, and it was finally put in place. Kennedy was given the option of ending the preparations for a Bay of Pigs invasion, but he accepted it, and in 1961, in spring of 1961, hundreds of Cuban expatriates who were living in the United States tried to re-invade Cuba and topple the Castro regime. They thought this would be a very popular invasion, that once the Cuban people sensed that toppling Castro was possible, they would have lined up and been very supportive. Well, it backfires. The logistics of the Bay of Pigs invasion were very bad from the start, and as a result, all that the Bay of Pigs invasion serves to do is elevate Castro's fear of the United States, and he further strengthens his relationship with the Soviet Union to the point of allowing the Soviets to base nuclear missiles on Cuba proper, just 90 miles from the border of the United States. So this elevates everything this is widely regarded, and I'm sure it's fair to say this becomes the high point, the closest that the United States and Soviet Union will come to exchanging nuclear to a nuclear exchange throughout the Cold War. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm hoping that we've set the stage fairly well. You'll read your documents for next Monday's class, and we'll have, I hope, a fascinating discussion of this issue. Take care.